Listeners, Howard and I spoke with a very special guest today. He is a former Wachtell and DOJ attorney. He is the anonymous judicial gossip blogger of Underneath Their Robes. He founded and led Above the Law, and now is the writer behind Original Jurisdiction. We walked through his career and life and learned new things about David, and we hope you do too. Enjoy. Welcome, David, to the Future is Bright podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Howard and Chris.
David, we'd like to start with the beginning, the genesis of things. A little bit, if you wouldn't mind sharing, where were you raised? What was some of your background before you went to college?
I grew up in northern New Jersey, in the suburbs of New York City. My parents are doctors, now retired, but I didn't really have much exposure to either law or journalism growing up. And it was a pretty straightforward, uneventful, type A kind of childhood.
Understood. So you got your undergrad at Harvard and you went to Yale. Was that expected of you because your parents were physicians, or how did...
Maybe they wouldn't have minded if I had gone into medicine, but law is what I ended up doing, and they were fine with that.
Very good. Was medicine, I mean, did you have one of those parents that were kind of overbearing and saying, hey, we think you need to do this and this is your only decision?
No, I actually have to say they were really not that bad. Part of it was, I think they realized early on that I didn't really have a knack for it. I don't really like the sight of blood. I'm not particularly STEM oriented. So I think the writing was on the wall pretty early.
And David, so you did smashingly well at Harvard. Sounds like you thrived. And then was law school always in the mix, or was that you're discovering that about yourself when you went to Harvard?
I don't think I really had a discovery about myself, in the sense I don't think I really knew myself very well. I was one of those people who went to law school because I didn't really know what to do with myself. I had majored in English, and my parents definitely wanted me to get another graduate degree or a professional degree, even if I wasn't going to go into medicine. And so, as somebody who was more oriented towards the humanities and social sciences, law school is where I wound up.
Yeah. And then again, just progressively, and you know, we don't have to have this giant plan, and I'm hearing your journey here. The idea of clerking, did something connect with you at law school, constitutional law, things like that, that really resonated with you?
Again, to be totally honest, clerking was one of the best professional experiences I've ever had. And my judge, Judge Drew Scanlon, is a wonderful judge and mentor. But to tell you the truth, I went into clerking because it was really the next brass ring. It was the next kind of thing that overachieving law students were expected to do. And I saw a lot of my classmates applying for clerkships, and it seemed to me that that was what was expected. So even though I'm very glad I did it, that's really why I did it, if I'm going to be honest with myself.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And then progressively, you see where we're headed. So with Wachtell, were there other law firms on the slate, or you're like, nope, only Wachtell, this is where I'm going?
I had summered at Wachtell between my second and third years of law school, and I had a good experience there. And after my clerkship, which was out in Portland, Oregon, I wanted to return to the East Coast. And so it was very logical for me to go to Wachtell. I also interviewed with some law firms in Washington, D.C., and maybe in hindsight, that would have been a good fit for me, just in terms of the type of work that law firms and lawyers do in DC versus New York. But in the end, I went to Wachtell, and I did have a very good experience.
And what was that experience like, David? I mean, that's like, rarefied air for many, many kind of professionals. It's the ultimate accolade to, to be part of. What was that like for you?
I guess the adjective I would use is intense. Wachtell is known for long hours, and that was definitely true in my day. I worked in the litigation practice. Much of their litigation work is related to their transactional and M&A work. So I worked on some exciting matters related to takeover battles and such. And I worked with some great colleagues. Many of them are still my friends to this day. Just really, really brilliant, talented lawyers. And so it was an excellent experience professionally, but it was very, very intense.
And what did you decide after? So after that experience, I mean, what was I'm a former architect. I remember cutting the cord one night, visibly when I made that decision. I was never going to go back and being a practicing architect. You must have had some soul searching when you decided to in effect, cut the cord and do something different?
Well, I had a stop in between Wachtell Lipton and going into media and journalism. After Wachtell, I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey, where I worked under then U.S. Attorney and future New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. And that was a fairly straightforward move. A lot of people work at a large law firm and then go into government or go in-house or go do something else. So for me, after Wachtell, which was an excellent experience, but something I concluded I did not want to do for my full career, I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office.
And so the impetus for you to think about starting above the law, I mean, was this brewing for a while or people thought you're a gifted writer, you speak well. How about you start above the law?
Well, again, there was another stop in between that. My first blog was actually a site called Underneath Their Robes,
Right.
which
Okay.
was a news, gossip, and humor site about federal judges. And I did this under a pseudonym while working in the U.S. Attorney's Office because I figured, correctly so, that it would not be a good idea to be writing about judges occasionally irreverently while appearing before them as part of my day job. So I did Underneath Their Robes for about a year and a half under this pseudonym, and it developed a following within legal circles. It was widely read by judges, even justices at the Supreme Court, law clerks, law professors. And so I discovered that I enjoyed writing about the law. I enjoyed legal blogging. I discovered that I had a knack for writing about things that people were interested in and enjoyed reading. And so eventually, after doing that for a little while, in November of 2005, I revealed myself as the author of this previously pseudonymous blog in an interview with the New Yorker magazine. And then shortly after that, and I'm abridging a lot here, but shortly after that, I left the practice of law and went into blogging. I spent a few months at a politics blog called Wonkette, which at the time was owned by a larger company called Gawker Media, which no longer exists. And that's a whole other story. And then after doing that for a while, I realized that I really enjoyed writing and blogging, but I wanted to focus more on the law rather than politics. While the fields are related, they are definitely distinct. And so that's when I came up with the idea for Above the Law, which was a bit like Underneath Their Robes, but with broader coverage, not just the judiciary, but law firms and law schools. And a bit like Wonkette, but not about politics, but about law and the legal profession. And so that was really the idea behind Above the Law, which I launched in August of 2006.
And when you launched Above the Law, um, was there a number two by your side helping you think through, or who influenced you to make that business decision? Because you came from, I mean, Wachtell and then DOJ. You had made, well, good money, and there's this journey that entrepreneurially, I'm hearing you that you're iterative and continuing to adjust. I'd love to hear some of how that worked out for you.
So when I came up with the idea for Above the Law, I realized that I was really a writer, really a content person. I did not have expertise in business. And back then in 2006, it wasn't quite as easy for an independent writer to monetize their
Yeah.
writing. I am now on the Substack platform, which has really revolutionized that process. And there are many other similar platforms where people can now make a living as individual content creators. But back then, the economics were slightly different. It was much more focused on advertising.
Yeah.
And I didn't know anything about advertising and banner ads and CPMs and all of this. But I had connected with some folks at a media company called Breaking Media,
Mhm.
which already had a successful Wall Street and finance focused site called Dealbreaker.
Mhm.
And I pitched the founders of Breaking Media on my idea for Above the Law, and they liked it. And so I combined with them, I collaborated with them and launched Above the Law on behalf of Breaking Media in 2006. And even though I left Above the Law a number of years ago, I am still an investor in Breaking Media. I have a modest equity stake in that company, and it has also grown quite a bit. And now it publishes multiple different industry focused websites. So I knew my limitations there, and luckily I was able to find some great people to work with. The founders of Breaking Media were Justin Smith, who is a very successful media executive and entrepreneur who's now at Semaphore. He was one of the founders of it. Another was Elizabeth Spires, who was the founding editor of Gawker, which was really this iconic blog in the early days of blogging. And the third co-founder was Carter Burden, who was and is an expert on technology, who had a hosting company at the time. So it was a very good intersection of people behind that company. They had tech expertise from Carter, they had sort of traditional media expertise from Justin, and they had new media expertise from Elizabeth.
What was it like scaling above the law? I mean, the things you guys have dropped, the news pieces, I mean, there's so much history that you walked out with the legal industry, and yet you're running a business and writing. Take us into that world.
So I would say it was gradual. We would just constantly pick up new readers.
Mhm.
And a lot of the way that worked is there would be some major story and we would cover it, and that would draw more readers to us.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't say it was necessarily a sort of linear increase in readership. It would have these spikes around
Yeah.
big stories. So in 2006, in 2007, when we launched, we were covering a very giddy period in the world of large law firms. There were pay raises and bonuses, and everybody was doing great. And there were salary developments that we covered, and people came to us to find out who was raising salaries yet again.
Mhm.
And then, of course, we had the Great Recession, and we covered that. And again, readers came to us because they wanted to find out important but negative news, whether that was layoffs or salary freezes or cuts or people getting deferred from law firms. And so we covered that. And then over the years, there have just been a succession of different stories that Above the Law has covered and covered quite closely, which have created more and more readers. The publication Above the Law was recently featured in the New York Times because it's very closely covering a lot of the developments involving Trump versus law firms that he is targeting with
Yeah.
these executive orders. And so, again, I think it really is just a situation where if you cover something and you cover it well and you do it long enough, readers will come to you. So over time, next year the site will turn 20, which is hard to believe.
It's
Over
amazing.
time, we built an audience. We also grew in terms of personnel. As I mentioned, when I started, even though I had colleagues on the business side, I was the only writer. But then every 2 years or so, we added a full-time writer, a new full-time writer editor. So we added Kashmir Hill, who's now at the New York Times, Ellie Mistal, who is now at The Nation and has written 2 New York Times best-selling books. And then the subsequent 3 editors are all still at Above the Law: Stacey Zaretsky, Joe Patrice, Catherine Rubino, and now, of course, they've been joined by Chris Williams. So there's a good, really nice group of talented people who have passed through the halls of Above the Law.
Were you surprised by the enormous success of the venture? I mean, I remember it being global, living in London, hearing about it and reading about it.
Yeah, I guess I would say I was surprised. When I started it, I had very modest hopes. I just thought, look, this will be a fun, interesting website covering the legal profession, much like Underneath Their Robes, which was pretty niche and which had a pretty small, influential, but small readership. It was a couple thousand readers a month, maybe. Whereas Above the Law today, I think, has 1.5 million unique visitors a month. So I guess I was surprised at just how big it grew. And I don't know exactly how one would count these things, but it's certainly one of the largest and most influential legal news publications out there today.
So take us through the decision process again to maybe pivot again in your career, because with all the things that you mentioned, like that seemed to be like the best fusion of all your core skills and abilities and interests to kind of, start and run Above the Law.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think what happens often for folks in their careers is, people change, your needs in your life change, your professional aspirations change. And so for me, by the time I guess I would say 2019 rolled around, I had been at Above the Law 13 years. And I think part of me was a little burned out on writing. One thing to know about Above the Law is the pace is pretty relentless. The site publishes 15, 20 stories a day. You're always worried about what you're going to publish next. You have to keep up with news. If something happens, people expect you to cover it pretty much immediately.
Yeah.
And there's this exhausting aspect to it. And by 2019, my life had changed too. My husband and I had welcomed our first kid. I didn't necessarily want to be at the beck and call of the news cycle the whole time. And again, I think I had maybe become a little burned out on writing. It was 2009, which was the first Trump term, and things had gotten a bit acrimonious in terms of writing about law and politics. And of course, it's nothing like today, but by those standards, I think it was increasingly stressful. And so I decided to take a break, and I took a little detour into the world of legal recruiting. I went to work for Lateral Link, which is a large legal search firm and Above the Law's first advertiser. I thought that working in legal recruiting would be a good way to utilize my contacts and industry knowledge. And in many ways, it was. Legal recruiting was certainly lucrative, better paying than journalism. And I worked with some great people over at Lateral Link, including the CEO and founder, Mike Allen. But then another thing happened in 2020, that thing called COVID, the pandemic. And what happened to me was I got very, very sick in March of 2020 with a serious case of COVID-19. And I wound up going to the hospital, and I spent 3 weeks in the hospital, including several days on a ventilator. And I wound up live blogging my COVID experience almost. I started chronicling what I was going through on Twitter and Facebook. And this got me a lot of attention. And people started following me because COVID was very poorly understood at the time. And I was trying to shed light on it, at least in terms of my own experience, just like I had tried to shed light on the world of the Supreme Court at Underneath Their Robes, or the world of large law firms at Above the Law. And this really helped develop a following for me. But also, the other thing it did, the pandemic that is, was this near-death experience just made me realize what I really wanted to do. And even though I did enjoy recruiting, I missed writing, and I decided I wanted to go back to it. And so in December 2020, I launched Original Jurisdiction, a newsletter on the Substack platform. I did that while I was still working as a recruiter, as a way of just returning to writing, just to kind of get my sea legs again. And I discovered that I really enjoyed it. And so in May of 2021, so actually, what is it now? 4 years ago this month, May, we're recording this, I decided to leave recruiting and return full-time to writing. And that's what I am doing today. I have Original Jurisdiction, which is a subscription-based newsletter on the Substack platform. I write a column for Bloomberg Law every other week, and I also do other speaking and outside writing. But in a way, I've really returned to my roots at Above the Law. I'm back to doing what I love, which is writing about law and the legal profession. But one thing I will say that I actually really like about Original Jurisdiction compared to Above the Law, at least the end of my experience at Above the Law, was over time at Above the Law, as the enterprise grew, I found myself doing less writing and more managing, administration, editing, dealing with advertisers, smoothing over ruffled feathers, stuff like that. And I think I was perfectly fine at those things. And again, the site was very successful under my tenure, but I really just want to write. That's my first love. And now, doing what I do at Original Jurisdiction, I get to focus on the writing.
So, David, you published a book, I believe it was 2014, Supreme Ambitions, and it was a novel. This was fiction.
Yep.
So, help me understand, is that the only book you've written so far?
Yes. About a decade ago, I wrote this novel, Supreme Ambitions. And it had always been a lifelong dream of mine to write a book, especially a novel. I was an English major in college, and I love to read fiction. And so I came up with this concept for a novel set in the world of the federal judiciary. It is about a young law clerk who wants to clerk for the Supreme Court, which is a very high honor for a young lawyer. And she goes to clerk for a judge on the Ninth Circuit, the West Coast Appeals Court. And that judge, her boss, wants to sit on the Supreme Court. So the book is about the relationship between the two women and their respective ambitions. And I kind of call it a Devil Wears Prada meets the federal judiciary. It's in many ways a professional coming of age novel, I think.
Mhm.
The young law clerk, Audrey, realizes some things about law and the legal profession that maybe she didn't realize at the start of the book. And so that was a lot of fun. And I would like to write another book. I've sometimes toyed with a sequel to Supreme Ambitions focused on the Supreme Court rather than an appeals court. I've thought of other ideas for books more in the nonfiction vein, but I have to confess, I haven't made a huge amount of progress. I've just been very busy with other things. Maybe I should enlist ChatGPT to help me write this.
Maybe. So curious, I mean, other nonfiction subjects, curious, what other topics would you like to write on?
Well, I've toyed with a lot of different ideas. I thought about perhaps writing a kind of memoir and essays where I would talk about these different chapters that we've just discussed, whether it was writing under a pseudonym at underneath their robes, or growing above the law, or my experience with COVID, which was just surreal in terms of just the interactions I was having with people online, just well-known famous people who were following my journey. I got a get well tweet from Cher, for instance. Different things like that, and maybe also interspersed with some personal things, parenthood, what have you. So I thought about that. Over the years, I've thought about different ideas for books about the legal profession, whether it's something about the courts or the Supreme Court, whether it's something about law firms. But it's very difficult to come up with an idea for a book because it is really just a much more demanding endeavor, and you need just a bigger vision, I think,
Yeah.
compared to just covering day-to-day news. So that's a little bit on the back burner right now.
I mean, was John Grisham an inspiration for you, kind of writing
Yeah,
about the news?
definitely. I've read a number of his books, and he's very talented.
Mhm.
I would like to be able to craft a thriller that's that gripping. My book was a little bit different in the sense that I knew it was going to be more of a niche audience, and there are no murders in it. There's no sex in it. It's not really as
Scandalous.
dramatic
Yeah.
as The Firm or The Pelican Brief or anything like that. But I think anyone who's writing fiction would of course think about Grisham or Scott Turow or all these other very talented writers who have written novels set in the legal world over the years.
And David, besides the book writing, is there anything in the future about developing your career more in the media? I've seen you on TV. Obviously, there's a whole different kind of career path that kind of probably encompasses. Have you ever thought about what that could be like that for you?
Well, one thing I do enjoy doing that we haven't mentioned yet is I have a podcast of my own called
Mhm.
the Original Jurisdiction Podcast. It's an interview format. So I get legal newsmakers to come on the show, and I've had some really incredible guests. And that's been a lot of fun, and I do enjoy that. So that's been another chance to develop a different set of skills. So I would definitely be open to doing other things in media other than just writing. I have occasionally done commentary on television, and if there are any television execs listening, I am totally happy to do more of that. But it's interesting. I don't know that I would want to do full-time television because one of the things about television is it's very glamorous and exciting, and your parents and your parents' friends see you on TV, etc. But one thing that's tough about covering a subject as complex as the law on television is the segments are very short. You get just a few minutes or maybe even seconds sometimes to discuss these very complicated topics. And to be honest, it's very hard to get into the nuances and to be accurate while at the same time being informative. My former colleague, Elie Mistal, whom I mentioned, he's very talented at television. He's quick and funny, and he can capture these very complex issues in these very pithy ways. I don't quite have that talent, I don't think. Maybe I could get better if I practiced enough, but I'm definitely open to doing more of it. But I think at the end of the day, I would still want my full-time or primary gig to be writing in a fairly long form, at least by day-to-day standards, way about the legal profession.
Yeah.
And if we go back to the law, given the crazy environment that we're living in, I mean, what excites you about the law still going forward?
Well, I have to say it is a little bit exhausting covering the law right now. I would actually prefer there to be less news, even if professionally this is probably beneficial to me in
Good for
some
you.
ways. There is so much public attention on the law, including attention from non-lawyers. This is definitely a time where you'll go to a Memorial Day family event or a July 4th event or a Thanksgiving event, and all your relatives will be asking you about this, that, or the other thing that Donald Trump did. So it is in some ways a very exciting time to cover the law, but it's also very concerning. I have been quite critical of a number of things the administration has done on the legal front. I've been especially troubled by these executive orders targeting law firms, which have been enjoined or essentially blocked by multiple federal judges. So it's a very difficult time for the legal profession, and the administration is certainly pushing some boundaries, I think, and stress testing the judiciary in a lot of ways. And again, I don't want to get into the politics too much, and I'm guessing you don't either. But I would just say that in general, it's a very exciting and interesting time to cover the legal profession. It's like that old saying, which some people say is an ancient Chinese proverb, but apparently maybe it isn't. May you live in interesting times. We definitely live in interesting times for people who are following law and the legal profession.
Yeah. Yeah, and David, you hinted at and would love to just touch on slightly. So you family, you have a son, you're married. Would love to hear more on that journey, how you two met, and the little one you're raising. Please share.
Well, so the little one is not so little anymore. He's now
Right.
7, and we
Wow.
now have a second child who's 1, also a boy.
Okay.
And my husband, Zach, actually, funnily enough, has a journey similar to mine. He is a lawyer by training, and he practiced for about a decade. He went to Georgetown Law, where he was editor in chief of the Law Journal. But then
Okay.
just this year, he left his job at a boutique focused on white collar criminal defense, and he's now the executive editor of SCOTUS blog,
Oh,
which
wow.
is really the leading legal blog on the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And it's funny because SCOTUS blog has been around for even longer than I've been into legal blogging. When I started blogging at Underneath Their Robes back in 2004, some of the inspirations I had were SCOTUS blog, founded by Tom Goldstein and Amy Howe, and How Appealing, founded by Howard Bashman. But there were not many legal blogs around in 2004. Now, of course, there are a gazillion of them. But in some ways, we've kind of come full circle. So Zach is now executive editor of SCOTUS blog, and I'm going to be helping out a bit on that. And SCOTUS blog is now part of Dispatch Media, which is this larger media company which publishes The Dispatch, which is also a newsletter, but it also puts out the Advisory Opinions podcast, which is a great podcast about legal issues, with the main hosts being Sarah Isgur and David French. And I'm an occasional guest on it, and I'll probably be a more regular guest going forward. So, yeah, it's interesting. We now have a family of 2 legal bloggers or journalists. And Zach and I have done some things together over the years. We've co-authored pieces for the New York Times, the Atlantic, law reviews. We've podcasted together as well. I had him as a guest on my podcast. We guest hosted the Advisory Opinions podcast together. So we've definitely done a lot of media together. And our other joint venture is raising our 2 kids, who are both very energetic boys, ages 1 and 7. And there's a legal angle to that too, interestingly enough, because we had them through the process of surrogacy with
Okay.
the help of an amazing egg donor and 2 wonderful surrogates. And That is a very law-driven process. There are tons of contracts for everything, and they're very unusual contracts compared to, say, the contract for buying your house or something. And it's a process that is very much wrapped up in the law, and the regulations around surrogacy, the legal framework around surrogacy varies from state to state. There's no federal regulation of surrogacy, really. So that's also been an interesting process, and certainly something that I've written a little bit about, not in great depth, but a number of years ago, I wrote a piece for Esquire about it, for example. And so that has also been a very interesting part of my life journey.
Are you guys done with two?
Yes, most definitely.
Okay.
We have our hands full.
I imagine. And any surprises or takeaways being a parent now?
Oh gosh, I mean, I guess I would say, and this is very obvious to anyone who has kids, I think it is in some ways harder maybe than people realize, if they don't have kids. But it's also in some ways just a ton of fun. Our 7-year-old is very smart and chatty, and has such interesting questions, and we have tried to explain various legal concepts to him, which is interesting. Right now, he thinks he wants to be a lawyer when he grows up. We'll see if he sticks with that. Zach is hoping he does not become a lawyer. He thinks that would be rather boring, but I think it would be kind of cool to have a lawyer kid. And certainly if he goes into the field, we would be able to provide a lot of help to him.
Yeah.
So we'll see. And then our youngest is very talkative. He's almost 2, and he's just at that fun stage where he is just picking up words so quickly. And it's really just fun to watch that mental development and just see how a mind is formed.
David, you have inspired a lot of lawyers to think for themselves, to step out and do stuff. What advice would you give to those that have budding interest or desires to write or to follow a path that's outside of traditional practice of law after having gone to a firm or something like that? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, sure. I mean, some of the advice is practical and some of it is more abstract. On the practical side, I would just say watch your finances, because one thing about journalism is it is not as remunerative as practicing law. And so a lot of times there are people who might want to try something other than practice, but if you have a large mortgage and you have kids in private school and you have student loans and you have all these other financial commitments, it can sometimes be difficult to make a career move. So I would just say that if you're interested in exploring things other than practice, definitely keep an eye on your budget and your finances, because on the bright side, practicing law is a very lucrative profession as professions go, and it can sometimes be hard to find something alternative that will compensate you as well. The other piece of practical advice I would give is try to explore things on the side. Now, that can be difficult when your hours are very long, which is why I think I had to leave Wachtell Lipton and go to the U.S. Attorney's Office in order to try blogging on the side. But you don't necessarily need to up and quit your job tomorrow and then go pursue your dream of starting a restaurant or an Etsy business or a legal blog or what have you. You can do things on the side. You can try baking for your friends and family on the side and see if they like what you make. You can try blogging on the side, complying with any requirements your employer may have, which I did not, pertaining to writing and social media. But there are things you can do to explore these outside interests before jumping both feet into some new thing. So those are 2 pieces of practical advice I would give. And then I guess on a more abstract level, again, I'll say 2 things. One, and I guess this is pretty cliched, but I found it to be true, is just really try to pursue what you love to do. It certainly worked out for me. I was very nervous when I left a very well-paying and secure profession like law to go into writing, but I certainly have no regrets. And maybe there is a sort of survivorship bias here because maybe I'm meeting a lot of other people who've been successful in their new fields. But I feel that for a lot of people who try something new, it does work out. So I would say that love what you do and try to find the opportunity to make a living from it. And then I guess the second thing I would say, and this, is well, I guess, the first thing you could say is sort of do what you love. But the flip side, to quote my old boss, Chris Christie, when he came on my podcast, was he also said, love what you do, in the sense that maybe you have a job right now that isn't your dream job, but a lot of jobs, you can find the things in them that you enjoy and you can focus on those. And you can try to make the best of whatever particular situation you are in. Because look, there are realities out there. People have financial limitations. People have geographical limitations. People have requirements in terms of looking after kids or elder care. And so you may not necessarily be able to pursue your dream job right away. But in the meantime, in terms of the job that you do have, try to do it as well as you can and try to enjoy it as much as you can, while, as I was saying, laying the groundwork for maybe trying to move into a full-time way, pursuing the thing that maybe your heart is really set on.
And David, speaking of finances and the law, if I return to law for a second, one of the common themes that Chris and I explore on our podcast is obviously law firm growth. And we're particularly fascinated by the increasing use of private equity coming into the business. Love to get your kind of 60,000 foot view of private equity in the legal industry coming on board.
Well, obviously, it's been a huge driver of business for law firms, and some of the largest law firms in the world have very robust private equity practices, including Kirkland & Ellis, which is the largest law firm in the world by revenue. Of course, it's not yet in the United States involved in backing law firms because of all the restrictions on law firm ownership by outside interests or non-lawyers. But in other countries, there have been moves towards ownership by non-lawyers. And so perhaps it would happen someday in the United States. But for now, at least, private equity isn't allowed to invest in law firms. But it is a huge, huge driver of law firm revenue and growth. And I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And so it certainly is not a bad idea if you're a lawyer, especially on the transactional side, to acquire some facility with or understanding of private equity, because it is just such a major source of deal flow today.
Any prediction on going forward as maybe the regulations change or mutate and allows more use of private equity coming into the industry?
So I think it will still remain. Right now, it is not regulated super heavily compared to certain other areas. Many of the investors in private equity are these high net worth individuals or sophisticated institutions. So it's not regulated in the way that a company selling stock to individual investors is regulated. And of course, there are also issues about tax treatment of private equity transactions. There's the so-called carried interest. Some people call it a loophole. The private equity people would probably not call it a loophole. But there is the question of the rates at which income that go to sort of the general partners or the managers of these funds should be taxed. So that's a recurring issue. But right now, as we're recording this, there is a lot of debate about a new tax package, and we'll not find out for a while what the final components of it are, but it does not look like the carried interest provision that private equity likes is going away. So that is probably staying the same. So I think it would have to take something very, very radical to change the importance and the trajectory of private equity. And the other thing at this point is there's so much money in the field right now. I don't know how many hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars are in private equity. And these companies are very powerful, and they have a lot of excellent lawyers and lobbyists who will protect their interests. And so even though there have been some critiques of private equity where they're saying, oh, maybe it's not good for the economy, or maybe it's not good for workers, or what have you, practically speaking, I think it would be very difficult to reduce the importance or influence of private equity in the economy just because it is so powerful and so entrenched at this point. So, whether or not you like private equity as a factual matter and as a predictive matter, it is probably not going away anytime soon.
Yeah. And David, I mean, obviously you've been at Wachtell, you've seen more than a decade, almost two at this point, of um, big law, the business of law, lots of changes. 2008 has caused lots of consolidation. Aside the current tumultuous dynamic with the White House, what do you think needs to continue evolving and changing? Because it seems like they're the most resistant to change in most ways. From your perspective, I'd be curious to hear what change should be expected or what you think could be coming.
Well, I think we can talk about two dimensions of change. One is in terms of how the firms run themselves as businesses. And on that front, I will say that in the past few years, we've seen a lot more change than normal. For example, law firms have been revamping their compensation structures, moving away from so called lockstep or seniority based compensation, increasing compensation for major business developers or
Mhm.
stars or rainmakers, moving into having two tiers of partnership, both equity and non equity, opening new offices. So I would say that in the past 5 to 10 years, the world of big law has been far more dynamic than it was in decades past. And even though I agree that in general, law firms and lawyers can be slow to evolve and sometimes resistant to change, I think the law firms are actually getting better at being adaptable, perhaps out of necessity. And then the second dimension of change has to do with how they go about their work, how they serve their clients. And here, of course, again, maybe everybody's tired about talking about it, but we have to talk about artificial intelligence or AI. And it is really transforming the practice of law. Some firms and lawyers are more apprehensive about it than others
Mhm.
after a series of well publicized incidents involving lawyers using, say, ChatGPT to write a brief and filing the brief without checking any of the citations. And it turns out that many of the citations are actually non existent or so called hallucinated cases. But that's, as many people have said, not an AI or a tech problem, that's a lawyer problem. AI is just a tool like anything else, and it can be used or misused. And so the lawyers really should have checked those citations. They should have checked that work product. But if you use AI responsibly, it can be a huge, huge help. I've even started to use it now more in my own work. I'm not having it write things for me, but now instead of asking a question on Google, I can go into ChatGPT, for example, and get something that's much more pointed and focused and responsive than scrolling through 1, 2, 3 pages of Google results. And so that makes me more efficient. So as I've written, because I've written quite a bit about AI and the law, actually, I don't think that AI is going to kill all lawyer jobs. It may reduce certain lawyer jobs in certain sectors, and certain so called low value work is going to be automated, but it also creates a lot of opportunities. And so, as again, I don't know who first said this, but it's now become a very commonplace saying, it's not that the AI tools are going to replace lawyers, it's that lawyers who know how to use AI tools well will replace those who don't.
We don't.
So I think that is a huge, huge development. And again, I have to give lawyers and law firms credit. I think many of them have been quite good about embracing the possibilities of new technology. So I think that in general, the legal world is getting better about responding to change and evolving as necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, David, uh, kind of in essence, wrapping this up, how can people find you, follow you, contact you?
So I am very easily findable at my newsletter, which is available at davidlatt.substack.com, and people can certainly subscribe to that. And I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn, so I welcome people connecting with me there. I have a Twitter account, although or X account, I guess I should say, which I have not been updating recently, but I'm certainly on there. Maybe someday I'll return. And I'm on other various social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Threads. But I would say the main ways of finding me are through my Substack newsletter or on LinkedIn. And it's always great to connect with people.
Great. So, David, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Really
I
enjoyed
enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you.